Here are some different possibilities that take place when we're using rests in music. And when you're using rests, what you want to always avoid is syncopation with rests. Or in other words, augmentation dots for rests can't just be used arbitrarily, and you can't just mathematically decide you're going to put rests wherever you think it seems to fit. There needs to be beat representatives, note representatives, or rest representatives in locations that show dominant beat units, and they can't be obscured, so we don't want to do that. The meter that you're in is hugely important when you're using rests. We have two very popular types of meter in our music systems, in Western civilization anyway, and that's simple and compound meter. Simple meter occurs whenever your primary beat unit, whatever you're used to recognizing as a beat unit, subdivides or gets the next notes faster in groups of twos. So if this is your beat unit, then the next faster group of notes would be in twos, and it would subdivide into twos. All simple meter does this. Compound meter, however, is something different. Whatever your primary beat unit is, the next subdivision, the first level of subdivision, divides into threes, or groups of three. Compound meter universally does this. So looking at simple meter up here, in 4/4 time, our primary beat unit, the thing we'd recognize as a beat unit, is a quarter note. We'd have the equivalent of 4 of them in a measure. And the strong beats in 4/4 time are on beat number 1 and beat number 3, barring any syncopation or any folk style influences or other reasons that you would accent something else. So without any further explanations, we have to anticipate that beat 1 and beat 3 need to have a representative. They need to have something showing in their positions. Well, beat number 1 is right here, and it occupies both beats. Beat number 3 starts right here. We have a representative. We have an eighth note. But if we didn't want anything else for the rest of the measure, we'd have to write it this way. After we've broken down the primary beat unit, quarter note, into an eighth note, we have to finish the rest of the beat with that same unit until we've closed out the rest of the beat. So since we've cut beat 3 in half, we have to use an eighth note rest to follow the eighth note to make one entire beat unit. Beat number 4 needs to have a representative, and that would be our quarter note rest. So we can't get away with doing this a different way. Mathematically, this would make a lot of sense. The problem is we see beat number 1. Beat number 2 is okay not to show because this note's ringing out for both of them. This is the way we have to notate this. Beat number 3 is shown. The last half of 3 is occupied in this rest, but beat number 4, there's no representative for it. It would fall right after this. We need to have a representative in place. So this would be incorrect, although mathematically it's very accurate. It might seem simpler, but we need to close out the rest of beat 3 first, and then we can put in a representative for beat 4. In the next measure, beat number 1 and the first half of beat number 2 are occupied by this dotted quarter. We have to close out the rest of beat 2 first, which I did with an eighth note rest, and then we can put in beat number 3. Beat number 4 doesn't have a representative. In 4/4 time, it's not uncommon to see the exact two halves, and as long as we have beat 3 represented, the dominant beat unit, we're okay here. So this isn't actually occlusion or syncopation. This would be acceptable. 2 quarter rests would be okay, but this is more acceptable, a little simpler. Another example in 3/4 time. Quarter note still gets the beat, but we can expect 3 beats in this time. This note's ringing for 1.5 of these beats. So we have to close out the rest of beat 2 before we can approach beat 3. To do that, we need an eighth note rest. So collectively, these two make 2 beats worth of space. So we need a rest for beat 3. We put in the quarter note rest. If we start this next measure with just an eighth note, but we wanted to rest for the remainder of the measure, we need to close out beat number 1 first. We do that by adding the other eighth note rest. Now beat 1 is intact. Beat 2 has a representative. Beat 3 has a representative, because in 3/4 time, there are 3 beats per measure. We need some kind of character or figure, some kind of unit to sit here. A half note rest wouldn't do it here because beat 3 would be occluded. That's okay over here because the two halves of the measure divide like that. 4/4 is acceptable to do that with. But in 3/4 time, this is what we'd have to do. In simple meter here in 2/4 time, I've only got 2 beats per measure. Here's the first beat right here. And I've got a representative on the downbeat, dotted eighth note. So I need a 16th note rest to close the rest of that measure out. I added that in, or the rest of that beat out, so I added that in. If we started the second beat with just a 16th note rest, then we could see this closing out the rest of the second beat. So 2 beats in this measure, everything occupies right. If we started out the next measure, beat number 1 with just a 16th note, we'd need a 16th note rest because that's the unit, that's the level that we've divided this down to. The beat unit is a quarter note. We've broken it down not just to the first level of subdivision, but the second level of subdivision, 16th notes. So we've got 16th notes broken into here. We need a 16th note rest to make up the difference, and then we can close out the rest of the beat with something larger. An 8th note is fine. So there's all of beat number 1, beat number 2. If we would just had an entire beat of rest, the quarter note would do it here. In compound meter, we can have the augmentation dot on a rest. We can't really have that in simple meter. You want to avoid doing that because that shows syncopation and that's a little odd. But in compound meter, all of the primary beat units, whatever the primary beat unit is, whatever you're recognizing as a beat unit, always features an augmentation dot, regardless of what you're in compound meter, what meter it is. So in 6/8 time, for instance, we have 2 dotted quarter notes per measure. If I have 1 dotted quarter note on the downbeat, beat number 1, then I have to have, if I wanted a rest for beat number 2, I could use the dotted 8th note, or dotted quarter note rest to close out the rest of that measure. That would be acceptable. I wouldn't need to break this down into 3 8th note rests. I could use just 1 dotted quarter rest because that's what the beat unit is in 6/8 time. I still see on occasion, actually it happens rather frequently, people coming in thinking that 6/8 time has 6 beats per measure and the beat unit is an 8th note. That's not indicative of 6/8 time, not typically. That would be atypical. What it usually is in compound meter, and more on this in the meter measure later on, is that you'd have 2 dotted quarter notes per measure, and they subdivided it into 6/8 notes per measure, but it would be like this. If this is the dotted quarter note beat, da, 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 da. Those are the 8th notes, but the accents are on the 1st and the 4th 8th notes, or in other words, dotted quarter accents. In the next measure, if we had a single 8th note being sounded, we'd have to close out the rest of that beat, the rest of beat number 1, with the same unit we've broken into. So we've broken down to 8 notes, we need 8 notes to close it out until we get to the next space that we can do something. A quarter note rest would actually be wrong here because that would be syncopating these two. Okay. Broken down into this, we need to close out the rest of the beat this way. So beat 1, 3 8 notes, and then beat 2 can be represented that way. In 9/8 time, we have 3 beats per measure, or in other words, dotted quarter note times 3 per measure. Here's beat number 1, 8th note, 2 8th note rests, close out the rest of the beat. Beat number 2, I have a 16th note. I need to use a 16th until I can get to the next note because I've broken down to this level. I want to get up to the next level of subdivision, so I want to get to 8th notes, but I need a 16th note rest to get this to equal 1 8th note. Now we've got it with the 16th note rest, we can close out the rest of the beat with just 8th note rests. And then beat number 3 is fine sitting here as a dotted quarter note. In the next measure, there's beat number 1, dotted quarter note. I have it tied to a 16th note, but I want to have beat number 2, the rest of beat number 2, as just rests. We've broken into the 16th note level. We need to use a 16th note rest to get us to the next level of subdivision. So we need this rest to close out the rest of the first third of the beat. Second third, third third. Here's all of beat number 2. Beat number 3, if we had a quarter note, for instance, and wanted to close out the rest of the measure with the rest, here's where we just use an 8th note. It's the subdivision there. It's all that's left. In 6/4 time, 2 beats per measure again. Dotted half note gets the beat. So quarter notes are the subdivision. 6 quarter notes would be the subdivision levels for 6/4 time. So if we had a single dotted half note in the measure, we could close out the rest of the measure, the other half of it. This is beat 1, this is beat 2, with a dotted half note rest, the equivalent of this. And this next measure, beat number 1, this is broken down to the subdivision level, quarter notes. There's 6 quarter notes in the measure. They'd be accented on 1 and 4. So since that's true, if I wanted, say, to sound a note on the downbeat, but then have this note sounding on the second third of the second beat, I need to write it this way and only this way. So we've broken into the subdivision level. We need to close it out that way. Beat number 1 is comprised of 3 quarter notes. So if I have a quarter note here and I want rests for the rest of the beat, I need quarter note rests. This is beat number 2. I need a representative on it. Quarter note, rest. If I want a quarter note on the second third of the beat only, here it is. And then the third third of the beat would be another quarter note rest. So I can't decide that I want to just do whatever I want mathematically. If I did, I could maybe see this as being, I don't know, maybe say this. So even though mathematically that's accurate, this isn't showing the subdivisions. I need the subdivisions here since I've broken into the subdivision level. So this is the only way to do this.